Hello, pattern readers. I'm afraid this video is delayed this week, and also I still sound like this due to a lingering cold. Nothing serious at least, but annoying. If you're watching this, thanks for bearing with me. In this video, I'm going to discuss the latest episode of The Rings of Power, and this is also going to be a sort of midpoint review of the season. We're halfway through. How is it going so far? And I'll give it some midterm grades for those of you who are into that sort of thing. Episode 4 was called The Great Wave, and it kicks off with that literal wave. Miriel is having a dream, apparently, where she sees the destruction of Numenor by an enormous wave. And from later in the episode, we learn that she has been using one of the remaining Palantiri, and presumably this is something that she has seen in the Seeing Stone, just as Galadriel does when she touches it. It was a pretty major theme of this episode that Numenor might be doomed. And look, presuming that a lot of you who are watching this show and watching this video have seen or read The Lord of the Rings, you know that it is, because Numenor is no longer around in the time of Aragorn and Frodo. So the question really is, what is going to lead to Numenor's downfall? More on that at the episode's conclusion. In the scenes where the crowds of Numenorian citizens are being wound up against Galadriel and the idea of elves taking over, there are basically two things that struck me. One is that Pharazôn comes across as a highly skilled politician. That was probably the most important thing they had to establish about that character, and I think they're nailing it. On the other hand, the direction of the extras and the performance that they gave was kind of lacking, a little bit cringy. We also get established that Pharazôn's son, Kemen, has eyes for Elendil's daughter, Eärien. That is a potential pairing likely to piss off parental units if ever I saw one. But I don't have too much to say about that other than that perhaps given the events of this episode, Eärien is being established as a character so that we'll continue to have a viewpoint character in Numenor to potentially witness some of the political machinations that I'm expecting to see. Her brother Isildur now, yikes, do not like him, but I don't really think we're supposed to. To be fair, I guess he couldn't have anticipated that his friends would also get kicked out of the cadets along with him, but still a pretty selfish and immature move on his part, like, just quit, man. I was totally with his friend who tore into him after that. But otherwise, we're still just kind of getting hints about what's really going on here. I still don't know about that voice that's whispering his name. There's a mention of a dead mother, his brother Anarion, who also talked about the true West. It's all just still set up. I was really interested in the scenes we had with Adar. From the appearance of him, the fact that he speaks with Arondir in Quenya, an elven language, and that he lets Arondir go as messenger, all of that makes me think the most likely explanation for who and what he is a corrupted elf, perhaps one of the original ones that was involved in the making of the orcs. It was really interesting to see Adar, and by extension the orcs who are following him, show some level of care for their brethren. Yes, he kills this injured orc, but he seems to show some sorrow at it and an attempt to do so humanely, for lack of a better word. It's very different from what we see of orcs in the Third Age, and so I find that more compelling. There's a shade of gray here, and just a great performance by Joseph Mawle playing Adar. Then we have the rest of the Southlands plot. Humans are gathering at the Watchtower, Bronwyn is taking charge, but Theo at least is not listening to her. I'm really going to try to acknowledge that Theo is a child, and he is clearly being influenced to some degree by this very obviously evil object that he probably can't just toss aside at this point. For those Wheel of Time fans out there, he is totally the Matt Cawthon character at this point in the story, but I have a gut feeling this might end differently. We shall see. In the meantime, I can't help smacking my head and calling Theo a dumbass because he is also that. We did learn that the orcs were specifically looking for this hilt that Theo has, so that is interesting. But the worst moment was when Theo thinks he's escaped, so he just stands there where he's still visible and smiles instead of running. When Arondir saves his ass, I had actually forgotten he was headed that way for a moment, so I did have an actual moment of surprise, but I bet most of you probably remembered and were expecting that to happen. I have to acknowledge this badass moment that Arondir has when he pulls an arrow out of the air and then knocks it to shoot. So when he and Bronwyn are reunited and she touches his arm to thank him, I have to admit, my shipper side came out in full force, and I was like, why are you not kissing this beautiful elf who just saved your dumbass son? Yes, I know, probably don't inflame the villagers by making out with an elf in plain view. But still, if any moment called for it, that was it. I am expecting the humans gathered here in the Southlands to split, maybe. Bronwyn at least does not seem inclined to submit to Adar's request. if we get those Numenorian reinforcements, that we could be heading towards a bigger battle here in the back half of the season. So there's a potentially good hook there. But then others like Waldreg at least seem like they would be more than happy to submit. Waldreg, as a side note, gave a little hint that this starfall that brought the stranger is a sign that Sauron's time is coming. Some might take that to mean that the stranger is Sauron. To me, I think it just reinforces the idea that this is a wizard who is sent to oppose Sauron. Returning to Celebrimbor and Elrond, one thing that really struck me in this episode is how much Celebrimbor does not seem to match what I think we're used to seeing as a portrayal of elves. If we think about the way elves are portrayed in Peter Jackson's movies, they are typically seeming remote, cerebral, cool in demeanor, otherworldly. And in general, I don't think they're taking that exact same approach with the portrayal of elves in this show overall. But Celebrimbor in particular seems especially humanized to me. Elrond is notably warmer than we saw in his portrayal by Hugo Weaving, although he's still cerebral at times. I think Arondir probably feels the most typically elf-like in his portrayal to me, at least an elf in the style of Legolas. But because he's more of a focal character, I think we get much more awareness of his emotions. He's not a demonstrative character, but I think we're still very aware of what his emotions are and how deep they run. Galadriel, of course, as she puts it, has a tempest in her, and I think that's certainly not what we usually think of as elf-like. But we can also see that she is something of an outsider among her people at this time because of that, and I think otherwise her demeanor feels fairly elf-like, although, boy, is that hard to define exactly what that is. Overall, I do appreciate actually getting to see a greater number of layers in the portrayal of elves. And in the case of Celebrimbor, I think we might just be missing a little something. We just need another layer, because if you told me that he was a human character, I would totally believe that. As I felt in episode 2, a real highlight for me is the dynamic between Elrond, Durin, and Disa. The main thing is I just fully buy these relationships. The friendship between Elrond and Durin feels real. The love between Durin and Disa, the loyalty she has for him, but at the same time, her warmth for Elrond and his respect for her because of her loyalty, it all just works. I had a moment of fear when Durin extracts a promise of secrecy about Mithril from Elrond, and the consequence of betraying it would be sorrow for him and his family. And I thought of all the sorrow that he and his children will face, and I had to wonder, will he betray this promise somehow, which would really hurt. Probably my favorite sequence in the episode was Disa's incredible singing, leading into Durin's anger with his father, and Elrond's reflection on his own father, which then helps Durin go on to have a surprisingly heartwarming interaction with Durin Sr. Just enjoy that from start to finish. Returning to Numenor. Despite Halbrand taking a backseat in this episode, I do feel that he is the perfect foil for Galadriel. Their strengths and weaknesses lie opposite to each other, and I think that can potentially push each of them to grow. Galadriel at this point really only knows how to go big or go home. So I literally laughed out loud when she ends up in jail and then later locks up her jailers. But I do think that after the scene that she has with Halbrand, that she was actually trying in the second scene with Miriel. I don't think she has enough understanding of the political situation in Numenor, but I think she did actually try to connect with Miriel and make an ally out of her. It might not have paid off if it hadn't been for the very clear sign of doom, falling petals from the white tree as soon as Miriel is starting to send Galadriel away. But I do think Galadriel probably planted some seeds that then paid off in that moment. I was actually surprised by the turn at the end of the episode and the decision to send Numenorian ships to Middle-earth. I'm sure there's going to be continued fallout from this, but it does seem like Galadriel has had some effect. The way I see it so far is I think what they're showing us is that the doom of Numenor is tied in with their rejection of elves. That makes sense. Miriel is trying to reverse this, but she's not going to be unopposed, and her position is precarious. Now I'm going to try to give you my overall thoughts on how I think the show is doing in 3 key areas in this first half of the season. Important, I think, to say up front, I'm really enjoying the show and it's basically working for me. I don't have anything majorly negative to say. I do have some concerns, however, about where things might be headed, although of course that still all remains to be seen how things will play out from here. So let's start with the area that is perhaps the weakest or the area where I have more concerns, and that is plot. If we think about what's happened in these first 4 episodes, it really seems like pretty much the entirety of them are set up so far. And it was especially noteworthy in this 4th episode because we're at the midpoint. Sometimes at a midpoint in the season, you kind of have a little midpoint climax. We don't really get that here because we're still pretty firmly in the setup. And if you look at any of the specific plots that I mentioned here, it's all still, where is this leading? Where is this leading? Setup, setup, setup. So it is much more of a slow burn than we are used to seeing. And I think there's good and there's bad about that. So the good part in my mind is that almost that they have the luxury to do it this way. This show has a couple things going for it. Number one, it's already been pre-greenlit for 5 seasons. There will be 5 seasons, 50 episodes of the show. That's already been decided when they bought the rights to do it. So there's less pressure to then establish a certain amount of audience engagement in order to justify its continuation. The second advantage they have is that there's built-in audience and knowledge around this property. So if you're coming into the show, and like most people are likely to have at least seen and or read The Lord of the Rings, you're going to have some familiarity. You're going to know about the world. You're going to know some of these characters you've met before. You're going to know the people. You've met hobbits before. You've met dwarves before. You've met elves before. You've met wizards before. And we know who Sauron is. All of these things, there's that built-in familiarity to it that is just, it takes away one of the hurdles of people getting engaged with something in the first place. So because they have those two advantages, they have the luxury, they have the ability to really spend time in the setup. And while that's a bit unorthodox with what we expect from television these days, it's very Tolkien-like for one thing, right? He's not just launching into the action on page 1. He spends time in setup in The Lord of the Rings in particular. There is, of course, the risk that you lose some people in your audience with that slower burn, because some people might be expecting to be drawn into the plot and the action sooner, and that slower pace may be less appealing to them. So you might lose some people that way. So there's a risk, but there's also a potentially good payoff at the end of it. My concerns about the pacing are basically twofold. One of them is pretty minor, and that is that, again, that there are going to be enough fans who aren't going to enjoy that slower pace enough that they'll stop watching. So that's a more minor concern, but it's a potentially real one. And then the bigger concern that I have is that we're looking at an adaptation where they have to take the existing material, the fact that they're doing this based on a portion of the Second Age, seemingly leading into the end of the Second Age. That's the period of time that they are going to cover. There's an outline that exists for that in the Tolkien writings, but there isn't an intricately detailed step-by-step plot to follow along with as they make this adaptation. They have to fill it in. They have to invent stuff. They have to create details. They have to add plot threads. They have to add characterizations. These are all things that are just not handed to them. There's a thin level of plot that they're working off of, and they have to build that out. There's always a risk to doing that. The most relevant example that worried me going into this show were the Hobbit movies. So, full disclosure here, I've only seen in full the first Hobbit movie. I disliked it enough that I didn't bother to watch the second and third movies in full. I instead watched and read summaries and reviews and recaps and things like that, because I got the sense of where things were going, which is that, they took this slim novel and they were padding it out into 3 long films. And in order to do that, you have to add a lot of stuff. The Hobbit as it was a nicely constructed narrative. It didn't really need added stuff. And it certainly didn't, in my opinion, need random extra action sequences. It already had action sequences, and the ones that were added were mostly pretty meaningless and not character driven and weren't even particularly enjoyable to watch spectacle from my perspective. So that was the worry that I had. That was an example of how you can pad out Tolkien by adding material, and that particularly did not work for me. The good thing here is that they don't seem to be taking that approach. Yes, they do have to add material to what is already existing, but they don't seem to be taking the approach of, well, let's just add a bunch of action scenes and so on. Instead, they seem to be taking the approach of, let's focus on the characters. Let's really establish these characters, spend some time with them, have them interacting with each other, and have that be the focus of these early episodes. And for me, that works a lot better. But whenever, again, you have an outline that you're trying to fill in the pieces of, there's always the risk that at some point along the line, you lose the plot. Things can go sideways, go off the rails. Another relevant example would, of course, be the ending of Game of Thrones. They had, at that point, only an outline, no text to work with. They knew where they were ending up, but getting there, they did not land that. So that potential exists here, and it's still a worry of mine. But that hasn't happened yet. Again, we're still just in the setup at this point. So for my part, what I think they have to do in the remainder of this season, plot-wise, is pay off some of these things that they've been setting up so far. They don't have to pay off all of them. Some of them can be long game setup, but they have to pay off some of these threads that they're setting up. I don't think they can afford to do a full season, 8 episodes of setup. But assuming they do pay off some of these threads in the upcoming episodes, then I think that there would be little to complain about for me, plot-wise. Some people still might not enjoy that slower pace at the beginning, but I bet you a lot of people who were concerned about that would come along in the end and feel fine about it if we get that payoff in the final 4 episodes. So they're not relying on plot to pull viewers in at this point. So to me, I think they're primarily relying on characters. In my opinion, the main thing that is going to make or break anybody's enjoyment of the show at this point is how much you connect with the various characters. Ideally, you would connect with at least one, if not more, characters in each of the various threads that we're following. And that's true for me. I would say, in Galadriel's plot, I've enjoyed her interacting with Elrond. I'm particularly interested in her dynamic with Halbrand. And then, as I've mentioned before, I especially enjoy Elrond, Durin, and Disa. And then Arondir, I'm becoming more interested and invested in him and his dynamic with Bronwyn. And then we can see how Theo and the coming war serve as obstacles to that. So those are strong points in all of those threads for me. I think the weakest thread overall, surprisingly, is the Harfoot plotline. Although I really enjoy Nori as a character, I enjoy Poppy, and I'm curious about what will end up happening with the stranger. That one is the thinnest in terms of plot by far. But I think it would also be perfectly reasonable for someone to say, that they're not connecting with certain characters. Maybe in a particular thread or multiple threads of the show, you're just not connecting with the characters. Then it might be harder for you to get into the show because you don't have that stronger plot drive to keep you interested at the same time. So that's a risky maneuver potentially to have so much depend on how much people are connecting with the characters, but they are putting a lot into that to try to make that happen. So for me, again, that's working, but your mileage might vary. And then the last thing that they are potentially relying on, at least as a bonus or another type of hook for the audience, are the overall visuals and world building. Everything that they're putting into it to create the look and feel of Middle-earth. And that's pretty top notch. I mean, I may have some little nitpicks here and there, but that's where a lot of the money for this show went. And I think that this is really as good as you're going to get in terms of that overall look and feel of something. And I think for some people, just the experience of feeling like you're in Middle-earth and you can at least tell that, care is being put into this. There's great potential with the characters and the plot line that you may be good to go along the ride, even if you're not quite there yet. And again, it's all about that payoff in the last 4 episodes. So if you follow my channel, you probably know I'm not real big on ranking things, assigning numbers and grades and so on. But I'll do it for fun for this video. Again, pretending these are midterm grades for the season. And like all midterm grades, that can certainly have a lot of potential to go up or down in the back half, depending on how things go. For the overall visuals, world building, all of those things that come together, I'm going to give that an A. I think I do have some nitpicky things that drop it down from an A+, but overall, this is very high quality work going on here. For the characters, I'm going slightly lower, even though it's my favorite part of the show so far, with an A-, because while they're certainly working for me, overall, there are so many characters being introduced that not all of them are as well developed. So A-, I think is fairly generous there. And then for the plotting, which as I've said, I think is the weakest to start, I'm giving it a C+ to start. And that is going to just totally depend on what happens in the back half, which averages out the first half of the season to a B+ or so, which feels about right to me. So if you want to play along, you can add your midterm grades in the comments for those 3 subjects, or your average, however you want to do it. I'm flexible. Just would love to hear your thoughts if you've watched all 4 episodes, what you think so far. And I'm really looking forward to getting into the second half of the season and hopefully again getting some of that payoff that we're looking for. So if you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a like, consider subscribing, and I hope to see you next time.